It's always an ungrateful task to be the last speaker of a conference. Unfortunately, the book has a summary chapter. Maybe some of you wish it hadn't. We have a summary chapter in the book, therefore we must have a summary presentation as well. But I do hope that I can keep your attention for the remaining minutes. Before starting my presentation, as one of the editors of the book and also on behalf of the other editor, Professor Nagy, I would like to express my greatest gratitude for the authors for their contribution. As all of you have experienced, it was a rather demanding and long job to complete this volume. But I'm pretty sure that our efforts were worthwhile, and I do hope that this volume is going to be the most cited book in the next years in the field of constitutional law. So the basic goal of my presentation is to offer a general overview of emergency powers in Central and Eastern Europe, and to make some concluding remarks in order to outline the big picture. So my presentation unfolds as follows. Firstly, I'm going to compare how the emergency regimes are regulated in the constitutions. The second part of the presentation deals with the nature of emergency regimes. The third part outlines the competencies and powers of the main political actors during state of emergency. And finally, the fourth part of the presentation offers a brief overview on the practical dimensions of emergency regimes. As a point of departure, on the next slide, I'm going to place the examined constitutions on a scatterplot. And this is the scatterplot. And the first aspect is the length of the emergency provisions calculated in characters, so within the given constitution. And the other aspect is the number of emergency regimes within the given constitution, for example, state of emergency, state of war, state of danger, and so on. And this scatterplot plastically illustrates the differences between the constitutions and the heterogeneity of the regulations. So proceeding in alphabetical order, Croatia goes here. Yeah. So the Constitution of Croatia mentions as much as 4 different emergency regimes, but the regulation is not very detailed. As for the Czech Republic, the overall picture is a bit more complicated. As my colleagues have already mentioned, the constitution itself of the Czech Republic mentions only 1 emergency regimes. Meanwhile, the country has a distinct law, distinct act dedicated to emergency regimes. This is the so-called Constitutional Act on State Security. Therefore, the Czech Republic has 2 dots in this scatterplot. Just to mention, this is not a competition. This is not a race between the constitutions. So I don't want to suggest that a constitution may outperform the other constitutions. Otherwise, the Hungarian fundamental law will definitely win this race, as you will see later. So in addition, even Hungary has 2 dots in this scatterplot. According to the current wording of the Hungarian fundamental law, we have this position. It's very spectacular that we have as much as 6 different forms of emergency regimes. And a whole chapter in the Constitution is dedicated to emergency powers. However, this configuration drastically changes within a week. As Colonel Till has mentioned some minutes ago, our fundamental law will change in the next week. So the amendment of the fundamental law enters into force within a week. So had this conference taken place on the next week, then this Scatterplot would be a bit outdated. And according to the new version of the fundamental law, Hungary takes this position, and the number of emergency regimes drops from 6 to 3. So one may conclude that Hungary spare not only electricity, but also the number of emergency regimes. Well, so Poland goes here, and Romania takes this position. Serbia is going to place there, and as for Slovakia, the situation resembles to those of the Czech Republic, and even Slovakia has two positions in this Scatterplot. And finally, I'm sorry, we have Ukraine there. Okay. So based on this Scatterplot, we may conclude that each of the examined constitution includes at least some provisions on emergency powers. If we exclude the Constitutional Act of the Czech Republic and the Constitutional Act of Slovakia, then the Hungarian fundamental law offers the most detailed regulation, while Poland comes second. At the other end of the scale, the Constitution of Slovakia and of the Czech Republic and Romania regulate the emergency issue in a succinct way, bearing in mind that the first two countries have a separate law, a separate act dedicated to state security. And the remaining three constitutions, Croatia, Serbia, and Ukraine, take an intermediate position regarding the length of the emergency provisions. So as I have mentioned, each of these constitutions includes at least some provisions on emergency powers. It must be emphasized that it is not as self-evident, it's not as obvious as one might believe. In order to broaden the horizon, I'm going to show you another Scatterplot, which includes each of the European constitutions. So here we go. And as can be seen, a number of constitutions dedicate only some very short, vague reference to emergency powers, and some of them don't stipulate any clear-cut emergency regime at all. This is the case with Austria, Luxembourg, and some Nordic countries, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and just to mention the Constitution of Italy. So the Italian Constitution mentions only one emergency regime. It's not a really clear-cut emergency regime, but it mentions the state of war. So as you can see, there are some huge differences between the wording of the constitutions. Well, it is worth mapping the position of the emergency provisions within the constitutions. Both the Hungarian and the Polish constitution dedicate a whole entire separate chapter to emergency regimes, and beyond Hungary and Poland, just to mention the basic law of Germany and the constitution of Albania operates in the same way, but they are beyond the scope of our book. Some of the constitutions incorporate the emergency regimes in a certain chapter. For example, the Constitution of Croatia, Romania, or Portugal incorporates the emergency regimes in the chapter on the president. In Spain, in the chapter of the government. In Serbia, in another chapter. And yeah, we have the Constitution of Ukraine. Unlike these other constitutions, the Constitution of Ukraine holds some so-called scattered provisions on emergency powers instead of a distinct regulation. And as my colleague have already explained it in a more detailed way, the regulation of emergency powers is unique in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia. These two constitutions make a short reference to the emergency powers. However, a separate law is devoted to this issue. The next slide offers a brief overview of the emergency regimes regulated in the constitution of the 8 countries. As even our book confirms, with a certain simplification, the emergency regimes fall into 3 categories. The first is the emergency regimes related to war or external armed attack or threat thereof. The second category is related to domestic conflicts, riots, for example. And the third, let's say, common category is for natural disasters. This table sums up the emergency regimes in the 8 countries. It must be noted that some of the emergency regimes may be related to more than one category. For example, the state of siege in Romania or the state of emergency in Serbia may be related to 2 categories. So each of these constitutions deals or at least mentions emergency regimes related to war or external armed attack or threat thereof. Most of the constitution contain only one emergency regime related to war, but some of them have more than one emergency regimes. For example, Romania has state of war, mobilization, or the Constitution of Slovakia mentions war and state of war. And the current wording of the Hungarian fundamental law has 3 categories for this kind of threat. Each of the examined constitutions, with the exception of the Constitution of Czech Republic, has a separate category for, let's say, domestic conflicts, riots or coup d'état, for example. And but in the Czech Republic, as my colleague have mentioned, the Constitutional Act on State Security filled this gap. And finally, we have natural disasters. Well, this is the third common category of emergency regimes. And apart from Romania and Serbia, each of these constitutions or at least constitutional acts of the other countries devote a distinct emergency regime for disaster. As for Romania and Serbia, the emergency regime of state of emergency and the state of emergency. So this form of emergency regime, in their wording, are broad categories that encompass threats stemming from domestic conflicts and disasters. The powers and competencies of the main political actors. It would greatly exceed the time limit of my presentation to explore the competencies of the main political actors. I mean the governments, the presidents, the parliaments during emergency regimes. Therefore, I confine myself only to some general remarks. While comparing the constitutional framework of the analyzed states of Central and Eastern Europe, it's evident that the roles and competencies of these main actors varies from one country to another. However, we may outline some tentative conclusions. In case of war, state of war, martial law, sometimes state of emergency, so let's call them severe emergency regimes. So in the case of severe emergency regimes, one may detect two basic procedures to introduce or to declare this kind of emergency regimes. So it may be declared either by the parliament, in the case of Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, in Serbia at the joint request of the president and the government, or by the president based on a decision of the parliament, in case of Croatia and Slovakia, or based on the decision of the government, or based on the decision of National Security and Defense Council in the case of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the less severe emergency regimes, mainly the state of danger or emergency regimes related to natural disasters, may be declared by the government even without the consent of the parliament. However, Ukraine and to a certain degree Romania are exceptions in this regard. Well, the declaration is just one side of the coin. It should be also investigated that once an emergency regime has been introduced, then who acts as a crisis manager? According to the well-known constitutional lawyer from the United States, Bruce Ackerman, so he claims that the paradigm case for emergency powers has been in an imminent threat to the very existence of the state, which necessitates empowering the executive to take extraordinary measures. So his definition clearly underlines the importance of the executive branch. And in my opinion, the chapters of the book reinforce that there's a certain shift of powers in favor of the of the executive branch. The crucial role of the executive branch, however, does not entail the marginalization of the parliaments. The legislative bodies, on the one hand, in most cases may disapprove or even revoke the presidential or governmental decrees related to emergency regimes. And on the other hand, the parliaments are often entitled to extend the ongoing emergency regime. And now we have arrived at the last aspect of the comparison. In general, this is the emergency regimes in practice. In general, until the recent years, we may conclude that the 8 countries examined in our book used to have little experience with the states of emergency. However, the COVID crisis and more recently the Russia-Ukraine war have changed the overall landscape. Well, in the post-democratic transition period, we have 2 countries that have never introduced any forms of emergency regimes. This is Croatia and Poland, so they have not declared any type of state of emergency so far. Both of these countries relied on ordinary legislation and to manage the COVID crisis without resorting to the emergency powers. It is worth to mention that, contrary to the common belief, officially no emergency regime was introduced during the Croatian War of Independence. We have 2 other countries in the second category. As for Romania and Serbia, the COVID crisis forced both of these countries to declare states of emergency for the first time in their post-transitional history, and neither country had introduced any emergency regime before the pandemic. And finally, we have 4 countries that had triggered their emergency powers even before the COVID crisis. The Czech Republic declared the state of emergency 4 times. Davin and Hajnalka have explained this situation in a more detailed way. Beyond that, natural disasters compelled Hungary to declare state of danger. 15 times it was the flood or inland water overflow, and once due an industrial accident. And as a recent development, state of danger was declared in Hungary due to the humanitarian disaster caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. In Slovakia, state of emergency was declared some 10 years ago due to the serious problems in the healthcare system. And finally, we have Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is the only state in our book that has introduced an emergency regime related to war. If we have a look at this table in the printed book, then we would find 1 instead of 2, but the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, compelled the country to introduce martial law for the second time. Yeah, and as a final remark, I do hope that if we meet in the future regarding the topic of emergency powers, then I do hope that I don't have to modify these numbers in this table. So thank you very much for your kind attention.